Now let me tell you a story. It's the kind of story that sounds like pure fiction, like something they cooked up in Hollywood, but I promise you, every bit of this happened just the way I'm telling it. This is about a hot, miserable day on the interstate, a bus full of ghosts, and a group of young men who made the single biggest mistake of their very short careers. Picture this. It's the middle of August. We're talking about that thick, wet heat that sits right on your chest, probably somewhere outside of Los Angeles, maybe on the 10, heading east towards the desert sprawl. The asphalt is shimmering, the air conditioning in the car you're driving is probably struggling, and all you want is to get where you're going. Inside a standard, slightly faded gray charter bus, the kind that usually ferries church groups or high school bands, things were anything but standard. There were 50 men inside that bus. 50. They weren't tourists, they weren't commuters, they were cops, not just beat cops either. These were detectives, SWAT overflow, federal marshals, and serious task force operators. They were the kind of officers who hadn't worn a crisp blue uniform in years. They wore jeans, hoodies, baseball caps turned backward, worn-out t-shirts, the uniform of the urban battlefield, plain clothes. They looked like they were heading to a Lakers game or maybe just coming home from a construction site. Before we continue, please take a second and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read them all. And if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, subscribe for more stories like this. The man in charge was Lieutenant Marcus Mac Allen. Mac was 45, looked 60, and sounded like he'd swallowed gravel and whiskey every morning since he was born. He sat right behind the driver, squinting at the heat haze. "Anybody else feel like we're baking in a giant metal sardine can?" Mac grumbled, wiping sweat off his neck with a bandana. The driver, a stocky guy named Dale, who was actually an off-duty county deputy, just shook his head slightly. "AC is cranked, Lieutenant. We've got 50 bodies and enough gear for a small war. It's gonna be hot." And that was the truth. Underneath the seats, tucked into duffel bags and strapped to chests under those loose t-shirts, they weren't carrying paperback novels. They were carrying serious hardware. The mission they were on was delicate, requiring absolute discretion and a massive show of force at the destination, which was still miles away. They were moving a large contingent of specialized personnel into a volatile area without alerting anybody, not the local media, and certainly not the targets they were planning to hit later that night. That's why they were on the bus. A convoy of 50 unmarked Crown Vics or SUVs would scream police louder than a siren. A faded gray charter bus? That just screams cheap travel. It was brilliant operational security if you could ignore the fact that they were all roasting. The atmosphere was heavy, not just with heat, but with that low-level tension that comes from being coiled tight for hours. These guys were professionals. They were bored, they were hot, but they were ready. They were the ghost bus, moving silently through the American landscape. Now let's shift focus about 5 miles up the road. We're talking about a group known on the streets as the 118th Street Bloods. Specifically, 4 young men who were definitely having a worse day than the cops, because their day involved a serious shortage of cash and an overwhelming abundance of arrogance. The leader of this little crew was a 20-year-old named Jamal, but everyone called him Rico. Rico drove a beat-up dark blue sedan with tinted windows, and he drove it like the laws of physics and the state patrol were merely suggestions. He had 3 guys with him: Snake, who was jumpy and always looking over his shoulder, Tiny, who was big and mostly silent, and Mouse, who was just along for the ride and looked terrified. They were parked partially off the shoulder, near a slight rise in the road where the traffic usually slowed down a bit before an overpass. They weren't waiting for a specific target. They were waiting for any target that looked soft and lucrative. "Man, this heat is cooking my brain," Rico complained, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. He pulled a cheap pistol from his waistband and checked the clip, a nervous habit. "We gotta hit something. We've been sitting here 30 minutes, and all I see is pickup trucks and soccer moms." Snake leaned forward from the back seat, his eyes narrowed. We gotta be smart, man. No witnesses. We need something quick. No cars with dash cams, no solo drivers who can fight back. Tiny, leaning against the passenger window, pointed down the highway. Hey, look at that. Rico followed Tiny's gaze. Coming down the long, shimmering straightaway was the gray charter bus. It looked drab, slow, and completely unremarkable. A bus? Rico scoffed. Nah, man. Too many people. Too much noise. Wait up, Tiny insisted, his voice a low rumble. Look close. It ain't one of them Greyhound lines. It's a charter. Dark windows. Probably old folks going to Vegas or maybe some corporate thing. Tourist cash, man. Tourists don't fight back. Rico considered it. Stopping a bus was a bold move. High risk, but the payout could be huge. A bus full of vacationers? Easy pickings. Wallets, purses, jewelry, a gold mine. And the way they figured it, in this heat, on this stretch of highway, nobody was going to stop to help until they were long gone. How we gonna stop it? Mouse squeaked from the back. Rico grinned, a flash of gold in the gloom of the car interior. He loved the dramatic flair. We gonna stop it the way we stop everything. Fast, hard, and with authority. He revved the engine of the sedan, the sound echoing slightly under the concrete overpass. Snake, you got the shotgun ready, Rico commanded. Tiny, you cover the door. We hit the driver, we hit him fast, and we tell everybody to drop it. The plan was crude, terrifyingly simple, and based entirely on the assumption that everyone on that bus would be unarmed, surprised, and compliant. They had no idea they were about to try and rob a vehicle containing more combined firepower than a standard police precinct. Back on the ghost bus, Mac Allen was checking his watch. They were about 20 minutes from their rendezvous point. All right, listen up, Mac said, raising his voice slightly so the men in the middle could hear. We're coming up on the final stretch. I want everyone ready to roll out in 5. Double-check your gear. We are not tourists. We are not relaxing. We are focused. A few of the younger officers shifted, adjusting their concealed vests or their holsters. They were all carrying. Not just sidearms, but extra magazines, expandable batons, and even some lightweight rifles broken down and stashed securely in the storage compartments below their seats. If things went sideways at the destination, they needed to be able to transition from civilian to full tactical response in about 30 seconds flat. Nobody was looking out the front window much. They were professionals focused on their internal checks. But then Dale, the driver, suddenly gripped the steering wheel tighter. His eyes went wide. "Lieutenant," Dale said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper that cut through the low drone of the engine noise. "We got company! Fast!" Rico's sedan had shot out from the shoulder, accelerating hard and cutting across 2 lanes of traffic. It was moving fast, deliberately aggressive, and clearly intending to get ahead of the massive bus. Rico didn't want to just pass the bus. He wanted to box it. He slammed the sedan directly in front of the bus, then deliberately hit the brakes, forcing Dale to react instantly to avoid turning the sedan into a pancake. The heavy charter bus screeched, the air brakes fighting the momentum of the massive vehicle. Inside, the 50 plainclothes officers were thrown forward. There were grunts of surprise, the clatter of gear shifting, and a sudden sharp silence as everyone realized this wasn't just bad driving. "What in the hell?" Mac Allen snapped, grabbing the back of Dale's seat for balance. Dale, who was trained for emergency situations, was already shouting, "They're blocking us! They cut me off! They're not moving!" Rico's car was now completely sideways across the lane, effectively creating a roadblock. And then, the doors of the sedan flew open. This was the critical moment. The moment when the 4 young men from the Bloods sealed their fate with stunning, cinematic stupidity. Rico and Tiny burst out of the car, weapons already up. Rico had his pistol, but Tiny was holding a pump-action shotgun, clearly visible in the bright afternoon sun. They weren't trying to be subtle. They were trying to be terrifying. They ran straight toward the driver's side of the bus, shouting obscenities that were muffled by the thick glass. "Driver, open the door! Now! Get off the bus!" Rico screamed, racking the slide on his pistol for emphasis. Inside the bus, Mac Allen didn't need to be told what was happening. He'd seen 1,000 variations of this highway robbery setup, but he had never, in 20 years on the force, seen one happen to him, while he was surrounded by 50 armed colleagues. For a split second, there was stunned disbelief among the officers. Not fear, but absolute dumbfounded shock at the sheer audacity of the attack. "Did those idiots just try to jack a bus?" muttered one detective, Detective Miller, near the middle of the bus. Mac was already moving. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was low, deadly calm, and carried absolute authority. "Nobody moves. Nobody draws until I say so," Mac commanded, his eyes fixed on the figures outside. He knew that if 50 guys tried to exit the bus at once, it would be chaos. He needed control. "Dale, keep the engine running. Do not open the door. Do not engage. We wait for them to make their move." Rico, seeing the bus driver frozen and the door still closed, grew impatient. He pounded the butt of his pistol against the glass, leaving a dull smudge. "You think this is a joke? Open the damn door before I blow the windows out!" he yelled. Tiny, the man with the shotgun, took up a position slightly behind Rico, covering the front of the bus. Snake and Mouse stayed near the sedan, watching the deserted highway, ready to grab the loot. They were focused entirely on the bus. They weren't looking for backup. They weren't worried about patrols. They were operating on the assumption of isolation. Rico, fueled by adrenaline and the belief that he was terrifying the occupants, stepped back and leveled his pistol right at the bus door lock mechanism. "Last chance!" Mac watched this through the tinted glass. He could see the aggression, the impatience, and the absolute lack of awareness in the young man's eyes. Mac felt a strange mix of pity and cold fury. These kids had just stepped into a hornet's nest with no way out. "All right, that's enough," Mac whispered. He reached down and unclipped the radio from his belt. He didn't use the police frequency. He used the internal tactical channel that connected all 50 men on the bus. "Bus 1 to all units." Mac's voice crackled softly into 50 earpieces simultaneously. "We have 4 suspects, aggressive armed, attempting vehicular entry. Repeat, attempting entry." The sound in the bus shifted. The bored silence was replaced by the tiny metallic clicks of safeties coming off, the rustle of clothing over concealed vests, and the quiet, controlled breathing of men preparing for immediate action. "They're going for the driver's side door," Mac continued, watching Rico raise his weapon higher. "Plan Alpha. Units near the front, prepare to breach. Units in the rear, maintain cover and clear the back door for egress just in case. On my mark." 50 highly trained, heavily armed officers who had spent the last 4 hours cramped and hot were now suddenly, thrillingly focused. They were ready to move from 0 to full combat speed in less than a second. Outside, Rico took one last deep breath of the hot, polluted air. He thought he was about to get rich. He squeezed the trigger. Crack! The bullet hit the heavy glass of the door. The glass spiderwebbed, but it didn't shatter. The charter bus had stronger glass than he had anticipated, a minor annoyance. Rico swore loudly and raised the pistol to fire again, aiming for the weak spot near the frame. That single gunshot was the only signal Mac Allen needed. "Mark!" Mac roared, but it wasn't heard outside. What happened next was not a slow, tactical deployment. It was an instantaneous, overwhelming eruption of force. The bus door, which the driver Dale had been desperately trying to keep closed, was suddenly thrown open from the inside by 2 massive detectives, Detective Harris and Detective Jackson, who were sitting right up front. As the door swung wide, Rico was caught completely off guard, his pistol still raised toward the frame. He didn't see 2 plainclothes detectives. He saw 2 walls of muscle, moving with terrifying speed. Before Rico could even process the sudden change in the situation, Detective Harris had launched himself forward, not firing, but tackling the armed suspect. Harris was a former college linebacker, and the force of the impact was brutal. Rico went down hard onto the hot asphalt, the pistol flying from his hand and skittering under the bus. At the exact same moment, Detective Jackson, moving like lightning, pivoted out and focused entirely on Tiny, the man holding the shotgun. Jackson didn't tackle. He drew his sidearm, a standard-issue Glock 17, and without a word, leveled it at Tiny's center mass. "Drop it!" Jackson bellowed, his voice amplified by the open space. Tiny, who had been focused on covering Rico, froze solid. He was staring down the barrel of a professionally held weapon, and he realized with sickening clarity that the man holding it did not look like a tourist. He looked like a very angry predator. But the real shock was still unfolding behind them. The moment the front door flew open, the interior of the bus, which had looked dark and empty through the tinted windows, suddenly became alive. It was like a vending machine dispensing 50 heavily armed men. The officers in the front rows, following Plan Alpha, were already pouring out. They didn't exit neatly. They flowed out, weapons drawn, immediately establishing a perimeter around the sedan and the two remaining suspects, Snake and Mouse, who were still standing near Rico's car, completely oblivious until the door opened. Snake and Mouse heard the shout, they heard the sudden commotion, and they saw Rico tackled to the ground. They turned, and instead of seeing a few frightened passengers, they saw a terrifying semicircle of men, all pointing pistols and rifles directly at them. 50 guns, 50 faces etched with exhaustion and sudden explosive professional rage. The plainclothes officers didn't look like cops, but they moved like a military unit. Their formation was tight, disciplined, and absolutely overwhelming. Snake, the jumpy one, saw the number of guns and his composure instantly evaporated. He dropped the cheap handgun he was holding, which clattered on the pavement. "No! Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" Snake screamed, throwing his hands up over his head, sinking to his knees in the middle of the highway. Mouse, already terrified, simply stood there, paralyzed, urine darkening the front of his jeans. Tiny, holding the shotgun, was still facing Detective Jackson. He was trapped between the immediate threat of Jackson's pistol and the sudden, impossible realization that the entire highway was now blocked by a wall of armed men. His shotgun, which had looked so imposing seconds ago, now felt like a fragile toy. He looked back at the bus. He could see Lieutenant McAllen stepping out, calm, collected, holding a large military-grade rifle that had definitely not been visible a moment ago. Mac looked at Tiny, and then slowly glanced around at the scene. Rico pinned, Snake surrendered, Mouse frozen. Mac spoke into his radio again, his voice flat. "Control, this is Bus 1. We have 4 suspects detained. No injuries to officers or civilians. Request immediate backup and traffic control at our location, Interstate 10, mile marker 43. Then Mac looked directly at Tiny. "Son," Mac said, his voice surprisingly gentle given the rifle in his hands. "Drop the scattergun." "You picked the wrong bus." Tiny let the shotgun fall. The dull thud on the asphalt sounded like the final curtain closing on their very bad idea. The silence that followed was broken only by the idling engine of the charter bus, which had come to a stop directly in the middle of the road, having just delivered a tactical surprise that nobody in the history of gang crime had ever anticipated. The 50 plainclothes officers quickly moved to secure the area, their adrenaline pumping, their mission temporarily forgotten in the face of this unbelievable amateur confrontation. They had been tired, hot, and bored. Now they were awake, alert, and dealing with a situation that was so ridiculous, a few of the older detectives were actually fighting back smiles even as they barked commands. The 4 members of the 118th Street Bloods, spread out on the hot pavement, were staring up at the sheer number of men surrounding them. They hadn't robbed a bus. They had assaulted a temporary tactical headquarters. Rico, pinned beneath Detective Harris, finally managed to gasp out one question. the question that would define the rest of his life. Who are you people? Detective Harris just pressed his knee a little harder into Rico's back, securing the cuffs. He looked up at Mac, grinned wide, and then leaned down close to Rico's ear. We're the guys who just needed a ride. If you could have seen the scene on that stretch of highway, you wouldn't have believed it was real life. It looked like the world's fastest, most over-the-top police training exercise. The bus was still idling, its big, heavy frame effectively blocking the entire eastbound side of Interstate 10. Traffic was already backing up for what would soon be miles, drivers leaning on their horns, completely unaware that they were being delayed by the most spectacularly botched robbery attempt in California history. Out on the shimmering asphalt, the air was thick with heat, exhaust, and the smell of ozone from the tires screeching. Rico, the mastermind, was struggling silently under the weight of Detective Harris. Harris wasn't even breathing hard. He had Rico's hands secured behind his back with heavy-duty plastic flex cuffs, the kind that bite deep. You have the right to remain silent, Harris recited, his voice completely bored, like he was reading a grocery list. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Rico wasn't listening to his rights. He was still trying to process the impossible image of 50 men, all of them armed, all of them professionals, standing around his beat-up sedan. I don't understand, Rico mumbled, his face pressed against the rough texture of the pavement. Where did you all come from? Harris chuckled, a low, dry sound. We came from the bus, son. Where else? Meanwhile, Lieutenant Mac Allen was moving with the focused energy of a general cleaning up a battlefield. He didn't shout. He just issued sharp, concise commands that instantly organized the chaos. Jackson Miller, secure the sedan. Check for additional weapons, IDs, and anything that might explain why they thought this was a good idea, Mac ordered. Perimeter teams, keep the gawkers back. We need 2 lanes open for emergency vehicles, and we need them now. The 50 officers, now fully unleashed, worked like a well-oiled machine. They weren't just cops. They were specialists. Within 60 seconds, the 4 suspects were cuffed, patted down, and seated on the curb, their heads bowed in total defeat. Mouse, the youngest and most terrified, was openly weeping, huge, shuddering sobs that shook his small frame. Snake was muttering prayers under his breath, staring blankly at the massive bus. Tiny, the man who had held the shotgun, was the only one still showing a flicker of defiance, though it was quickly extinguished when Detective Jackson stood over him, holding the confiscated pump action. Nice piece of gear, Jackson commented, turning the shotgun over in his hands. Too bad you didn't know how to use it. Tiny just shook his head slowly, a look of profound, stomach-dropping realization washing over him. Man, we thought it was a tourist bus. Old folks. A young detective named O'Connell, who had been sitting near the back, couldn't help himself. He laughed out loud. It started as a snicker and built into a full, barking laugh that cut through the tension. Old folks, O'Connell called out. Did we look like we were carrying souvenir t-shirts, son? We look like we're heading to bingo night? The tension that had coiled inside the 50 officers for the last few hours snapped, replaced by a wave of disbelief and dark humor. This is better than a coffee break, Lieutenant, Detective Miller called out, wiping sweat from his brow. Seriously, I needed the workout. Mac Allen didn't smile. He had a job to do. This unexpected confrontation had just put a massive kink in their highly secretive operation. He walked over to Dale, the driver, who was still seated in the bus, gripping the wheel, his knuckles white. You okay, Dale? Mac asked. Dale blinked a few times, letting out a long, shaky breath. I'm fine, Lieutenant. Just surprised. They really shot at the door, huh? They did, Mac confirmed, running a finger over the spider-webbed glass. Good glass, Dale. We'll need to write up a report on this. We're going to be delayed, but the bus is still operational. Get ready to move as soon as the local PD clears the scene. Mac stepped back out onto the highway, pulling his radio off the internal tactical channel and switching to the standard emergency frequency. Control, this is Bus 1, still on scene. Status report, 4 in custody, situation contained. We need immediate traffic control and at least 3 transport units. And Control, Mac added, a hint of weariness entering his voice. When the locals arrive, tell them we've got 50 very warm, very cranky federal and county assets who just prevented a mass casualty incident. Now let me tell you about the arrival of the local police. This is where the story goes from tense action to high comedy. The first car to arrive wasn't the highway patrol, but a county sheriff's unit, a black and white driven by a young deputy named Officer Diaz. Diaz was expecting a simple fender bender or maybe a 2-car robbery. He certainly wasn't expecting what he saw. He pulled up to the enormous traffic jam, flipped on his loudspeaker, and started ordering drivers to move over. Then he saw the source of the blockage. A charter bus, a sedan sideways in front of it, and about a dozen men surrounding 4 cuffed suspects. Diaz parked his cruiser and stepped out, adjusting his uniform. He scanned the scene, looking for the commanding officer. He saw Mac Allen standing near the front of the bus, holding that rifle, looking every bit like a grizzled, unkempt civilian. "All right, what happened here?" Diaz called out, walking toward Mac. "Who's in charge?" "Sir, you need to put that weapon down. We'll secure the evidence." Mac just looked at the young deputy, sighed, and lowered the rifle slightly, resting the butt on the hot pavement. "I'm in charge, deputy," Mac said, "and this is evidence." He gestured broadly toward the 49 other heavily armed men who were now milling around, many of them openly carrying sidearms and checking their magazine levels. Diaz's eyes went wide. He started counting. 1, 2, 3, 5, 10. He stopped counting at about 25 because his brain simply refused to process the image of so many armed civilians. "Sir, I need you to identify yourself immediately, and all these men need to secure their weapons. This is an active scene," Diaz stammered, his hand hovering nervously near his own sidearm. Mac pulled out his wallet, flipped open his credentials, and showed Diaz the badge and ID. "Lieutenant Marcus Allen, Multi-Jurisdictional Task Force. These are my men, deputy. We were transporting personnel. We are all active law enforcement." Diaz stared at the badge, then back at the assembly of men, hoodies, backwards caps, utility pants, and a staggering amount of firepower. They looked like a biker gang that had been issued tactical gear. 50 of you?" Diaz asked, his voice cracking. 50, Mac confirmed dryly. "Plus the driver, who is also county. We were moving discreetly." Diaz ran a hand through his hair. He finally understood. These 4 idiots hadn't just tried to rob a bus. They had tried to rob a highly specialized covert unit of 50 armed police officers. The sheer absurdity of it made Diaz want to sit down right there in the middle of the highway and laugh until he cried. He radioed Control, trying to keep the hysteria out of his voice. "Control, this is 1043, requesting Sergeant Johnson immediately, and, Control, advise the sergeant that the number of victims is 0 and the number of armed officers on scene is approximately 51. I repeat, 51. The sheriff's dispatcher, a woman named Janice who had been fielding calls for 20 years, paused for a full 3 seconds. 1043, repeat your last transmission on armed officers. 51, Janice. The bus was full of them, plain clothes. They apprehended the suspects. I need transport units and a lot of paperwork. Janice sighed. Copy that, 1043. You guys have fun. As Diaz started coordinating the immediate scene, more patrol cars arrived, 2 CHP units and a second sheriff's vehicle carrying Sergeant Johnson, a heavy-set man who was immediately suspicious of the whole situation. Johnson took one look at the sheer wall of muscle, vests, and automatic rifles, and immediately sought out Mac Allen. Lieutenant Allen, Johnson began, clearly trying to establish local authority. What in the holy hell is going on here? We have a major incident, traffic backed up to the 60, and you have 50 men running around looking like a paramilitary unit. Mac, who had zero patience for bureaucratic turf wars, just pointed toward the 4 suspects sitting miserably on the curb. Sergeant, what's going on is those 4 young men tried to commit armed robbery on a bus carrying 5 separate federal and state jurisdictions of law enforcement personnel on a coordinated, highly sensitive operation, Mac explained, his voice low and serious. We handled the situation. They fired 1 shot, no return fire necessary. Now, if you can get your transport units here, we can proceed with our primary mission. Johnson stared at the suspects. Rico looked up, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was finally starting to grasp the monumental scale of his failure. He had expected to intimidate a few scared tourists. Instead, he had interrupted a massive, coordinated police movement. You were all cops? Rico whispered to Detective Harris, who was logging the evidence from the sedan. Harris zipped up the evidence bag containing Rico's pistol. Yeah, kid, we were all cops. You picked the one day, the one bus, on the one highway, where 50 of us were all heading to the same place. You have the worst luck I've ever seen. The other officers were now taking advantage of the forced break. They were grabbing bottles of water from a cooler on the bus, stretching their legs, and talking shop. The confrontation had served as a high-stakes, real-world stress test, and they had passed with flying colors. The transition from cramped boredom to full tactical response had been instantaneous and flawless. Think of the paperwork on this one, Mac, Detective Miller called out, leaning against the bus tire. 50 witnesses minimum, 4 counts of attempted robbery, felony assault on a police officer, resisting arrest. Wait, they didn't resist much, did they? They just kind of deflated. Mac rubbed his temples. The paperwork was going to be a nightmare, a multi-agency headache that would span weeks. But he couldn't deny the efficiency of the takedown. They didn't stand a chance, Mac confirmed. They relied entirely on the element of surprise and the intimidation factor. They didn't account for the fact that every passenger on that bus was trained to deal with that exact situation. As the uniformed officers started interviewing the suspects and preparing them for transport, the focus shifted back to the mission. The clock was ticking. They were still miles from their target location, and the delay was eating into their operational window. Mac called his senior team members together, Harris, Jackson, and a few others, for a quick huddle near the rear of the bus, away from the local police radios. "All right, gentlemen, listen up," Mac said, his voice dropping to a serious tone that cut through the surrounding noise. "This sideshow is wrapping up. We have a hard deadline. We've lost maybe 30 minutes. We need to roll. Dale, how fast can you get us to the rendezvous point?" Dale leaned out of the bus window. "I can make up the time, Lieutenant. The bus is heavy, but she's got the power. I'll push it." "Good," Mac confirmed. "We need to transition back to mission focus immediately. We just had a massive adrenaline dump. I want everyone checking their headspace. We are going into a potentially lethal situation. Don't let the amateur hour here distract you from the real threat waiting for us tonight." The officers nodded, their momentary amusement fading as they remembered the gravity of their original assignment. The Bloods were a ridiculous distraction. The mission ahead was deadly serious. Mac looked back at the 4 suspects being loaded into the patrol cars. Rico was arguing weakly with Sergeant Johnson, still protesting his bad luck. It was a perfect storm of idiocy and fate. They hadn't just picked a bad target. They had picked the worst possible target in the entire state on that particular afternoon. As the sheriff's department started moving the suspects, Mac ordered his men back onto the bus. "Let's go, people. Get back in your seats. We're rolling in 5 minutes. Let the locals handle the paperwork. We have bigger fish to fry." The 50 plainclothes officers filed back into the faded gray charter bus. They were still hot, but the tension was gone, replaced by a kind of focused energy. They were ready. Dale started the ignition, letting the air brakes hiss one last time. The bus slowly pulled out, carefully maneuvering around the police cars and the abandoned sedan, which was now being taped off as evidence. As the bus merged back onto the highway, the heavy vehicle vibrating slightly, Detective Miller leaned forward to Mac. "Mac, I gotta ask," Miller said, grinning. "Are we going to put this in the official report? That we were held up by 4 kids who thought we were going to Vegas?" Mac looked out the window at the receding scene. The flashing lights, the backed-up traffic, the image of Rico and his crew being driven away. "We are going to write a report that says we encountered 4 armed individuals attempting to impede interstate traffic while brandishing firearms," Mac stated firmly. He paused, then added, "And no, Miller, we are not putting the part about them thinking we were old folks with wallets full of cash. It would make us look ridiculous." But the story was already out, whispered from one uniformed officer to the next, spreading like wildfire. 4 wannabe gang members tried to rob a bus, and that bus turned out to be a tactical nuke. The ghost bus, having delivered a devastating, unexpected punch, was now moving again, speeding toward its original destination, leaving behind a baffled local police force and 4 young men whose lives had just been irrevocably changed by a single catastrophic error in judgment and the worst luck imaginable. They were heading straight into the legal system, facing charges that would make them legends in the prison yard, not for what they accomplished, but for the sheer scale of their failure. The Bloods had stopped a bus on the highway, but the bus was about to stop their world completely. The 4 suspects, Rico, Tiny, Snake, and Mouse, were officially processed. The sight of Sergeant Johnson and Deputy Diaz trying to manage 50 armed, plainclothes federal and county officers, who were all technically witnesses and victims and arresting officers, was frankly hilarious to watch, provided you weren't the one holding the clipboard. Sergeant Johnson finally gave up trying to get a statement from every single detective. He looked at Mac Allen, who was leaning against the bus, sipping from a lukewarm bottle of water. "Lieutenant Allen," Johnson said, shaking his head slowly, "I have been doing this for 25 years. I've seen bank robberies, drug busts, and a naked guy trying to steal a traffic light, but I have never seen anything this stupid. Ever. You realize these kids just committed a federal offense against basically every level of government simultaneously?" Mac nodded. His eyes narrowed against the afternoon sun. "We are aware, Sergeant. That's why we're going to be delivering the evidence package to the U.S. Attorney's Office directly. This is serious time they're looking at. Attempted armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and felony interference with a massive multi-agency operation." Johnson whistled softly. "They'll be legends in San Quentin, I guess. The only guys dumb enough to try and stick up the Fed's field trip." The transport units arrived. 3 sheriff's vans that looked woefully inadequate for the task of clearing the scene. The 4 members of the 118th Street Bloods were placed inside, separated and silent. As Rico was shoved into the back of the van, he caught Mac Allen's eye one last time. There was no defiance left, only utter devastation. Mac didn't offer a smirk or a word of lecture. He simply nodded, a silent confirmation of the absolute destruction Rico had brought upon himself and his crew. With the suspects secured and the local authorities taking control of the impound process for Rico's beat-up sedan, Mac knew it was time to move. The delay, while eventful, was costly. "All right, gentlemen, formation," Mac barked. "We are buttoning this up. Everything stays concealed. We look like tourists again. Dale, let's roll, and let's make up some time." The 50 officers, now moving with renewed purpose, climbed back onto the gray charter bus. The adrenaline was receding, replaced by a focused calm. They were professionals who had just proved their readiness in the most absurd way possible. As the bus pulled away, slowly navigating the remaining police presence and the rubberneckers, Detective Miller settled into his seat near the middle. He looked at Detective Jackson across the aisle. "You know, Jackson," Miller mused, pulling a baseball cap down over his eyes, "I was really dreading the drive. I thought I was going to be bored stiff." Jackson chuckled, checking the safety on his sidearm before tucking it back into his waistband. "Boredom is overrated, Miller. Besides, think of the story we get to tell our kids. How was work, Dad? Oh, just got held up by 4 geniuses who tried to rob 50 armed men on a bus. The conversation was light, a way to bleed off the excess tension. But beneath the jokes, there was a profound understanding. They were all ready. The unexpected stress test had confirmed their readiness for the much more dangerous mission ahead. Dale, the driver, pushed the bus hard. The big engine roared, and the faded gray vehicle ate up the miles, quickly leaving the sirens and the flashing lights behind. They were moving from the chaotic heat of the highway incident back into the quiet, anonymous flow of interstate traffic. The ghost bus was back in business. Now let's talk about the consequences for the 4 young men. Because this wasn't just a simple arrest. This was a career-ending, life-altering mistake. When Rico, Tiny, Snake, and Mouse were booked into the county jail, they were initially treated like high-profile criminals because of the sheer volume of paperwork and the multi-agency response. But as the full story leaked through the system that they had tried to rob a bus full of cops, the respect evaporated, replaced by incredulous mockery. Rico, the one who had made the plan, faced the harshest reality. He was quickly separated from his crew and interrogated by agents from 3 different federal agencies, DEA, ATF, and the U.S. Marshals, all of whom had personnel on that bus. They weren't interested in a simple street robbery. They were interested in Rico's entire organization, his suppliers, and his contacts. The robbery attempt, which was supposed to be a quick cash grab, turned into a massive, federally coordinated investigation that dismantled the remaining structures of the 118th Street Bloods in that area. Rico's arrogance provided the federal agencies with the perfect legal leverage they needed to go after targets that were much bigger than him. In the end, Rico was charged with over a dozen felonies, including attempted murder of a federal officer, since he fired a weapon at the door where Mac Allen was sitting. His lawyer, a public defender who looked exhausted just hearing the facts, informed him that his bad luck was statistically unbelievable. "Rico," the lawyer said during their first meeting, leaning across the table in the interview room, "you didn't just rob a bus. You stopped a mobile command center. You hit the jackpot of bad decisions. We're talking decades minimum." Rico sat silently, the reality finally crushing him. He thought back to the moment the door swung open, revealing the wall of men. He thought back to the sheer, terrifying speed of Detective Harris tackling him. "We just needed money," Rico whispered, the sound hollow. "Everybody needs money, son," the lawyer sighed. "But most people don't try to get it by robbing a vehicle that contained a higher concentration of law enforcement personnel than the local precinct house." Tiny, Snake, and Mouse fared only marginally better. They were accessories to the crime, and they all faced serious prison time, their futures defined by that one hot, stupid afternoon on the Interstate 10. They became a cautionary tale whispered in the yards, the guys who tried to go big and ended up hitting the one thing that hit back 50 times harder. As for Lieutenant Mac Allen and his 50 men, they arrived at their destination late that evening. They executed their primary mission flawlessly, a high-risk takedown operation that required the kind of intense focus and coordinated force they had just unintentionally rehearsed. The fact that they had already experienced a high-stress, leave-fire situation on the bus actually worked to their advantage. They were sharp, their reflexes honed, and their communication tight. The mission was a success, leading to several major arrests and the seizure of a significant cache of illegal weapons. The incident on the highway, however, became legendary within the ranks of the various task forces. It was the story told at every annual barbecue, every retirement dinner, and every boring training seminar. "Remember the Bloods?" someone would inevitably ask, and the room would erupt in laughter. Mac Allen never did put the full hilarious context in the official report he filed for the task force. He kept it strictly procedural, focusing on the swift, controlled response. He maintained the professionalism required for his serious line of work. But late one night, a few weeks later, after the mission was complete and the paperwork was mostly filed, Mac was sitting in his office, looking at the photographs of the confiscated evidence from the bus incident: Rico's cheap pistol, Tiny's pump-action shotgun, and the spiderweb pattern on the bus door. Detective Miller walked in, dropping a thick file on Mac's desk. "Final disposition report on the Bloods, Lieutenant. All 4 pled guilty. They're off the street for a long, long time." Mac picked up the file, flipping through the pages detailing the severity of the sentences. Justice had been served, brutally and swiftly. "Good," Mac said, closing the file. "That's the end of that sideshow." Miller lingered, leaning against the door frame. "You know, I still can't get over it. The timing, the sheer dumb luck." Mac looked up at him, a rare, tired smile touching his lips. "They were looking for easy money, Miller. They saw a quiet, unsuspecting bus full of people they thought were weak. They saw an opportunity and they took it." He tapped the file with his index finger. "What they didn't realize is that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a bus full of cash. It's 50 men who are bored, hot, and professionally trained to stop exactly what they tried to do. They stopped the wrong ride that day, Miller. They stopped the ghost bus." And with that, the story of the 4 young men who tried to rob the one bus they absolutely should have left alone faded from the headlines and into the permanent, legendary lore of law enforcement. A perfect, unbelievable example of the worst luck in American crime history. The bus kept rolling, the mission was completed, and the only thing truly damaged was the future of 4 men who mistook discretion for weakness. The end.